Today we are in fact talking about visual hierarchy, and it's going to be fun. I think it's going to be fun because I like to talk about this stuff. But visual hierarchy, I think, is really cool because it's one of the, once you get a feel for it, it is one of the best and fastest ways to like organize your document, organize your design, and get people's eyes to go where you want them to go. Like, if you've ever seen any of those things where it's like, you'll read this first, then you'll read that, now you'll read this. Let me see if I can Google it so I don't sound like an insane person. Here we go. These are what I'm talking about. So yeah, you ever seen one of these where it's like, you read this first, then you read this, then you read this last? That's visual hierarchy. That's 100% managing the layout of your design by targeting which thing your viewers will see first and then guiding their eye around the page so that you, as the designer, can control what they see, what they're focused on, and allows you to order the elements on your page in order of importance, which is also big, right? I think a lot of the time when we look at a design and we can't figure out like what's wrong, you know, or like people are focusing on the wrong things, or like we're not, you know, we wanted people to click on this button and no one's clicking on it. It's actually an issue of hierarchy, right? And a lot of that has to do with those like Gestalt principles that we talked about last week. So once we know the ways in which people's brains kind of generally work, the ways in which they want to group information or attempt to group information, then we can start leveraging those like shortcuts to capture and direct users' attention. Without this, we will inevitably create designs that are like really unintuitive and really misguiding. I'm sure you've used applications like that before, where you're just looking at it and you're like, what am I supposed to do? Where's the button I'm looking for? What happened? Like, you open a menu and it's not anything that you thought was going to be in there. Like, all of that kind of stuff has to do with visual hierarchy, usually in regards to the expectations that are being set and where you think you'll find things versus where they actually live. You know, if we were to, like, jumping back to that example, like, you read this first, you read this next. Sharing, you know, if we're looking at something like this, you know, and the goal is you want people to click on a button, right? You don't want to put your button way over here in the thing that you read last and then sit and wonder, why is no one clicking on my button, right? You probably want the button here. You want some kind of a headline that's like, here's why you're on this page. Here's what to expect when you click this button. And then the button goes in the second place. You've established visual hierarchy. The way that we create visual hierarchy is by using size, placement, and color to manipulate the visual weight of the elements on the page and help your most important elements stand out. So here in the example that we're looking at, we've got kind of a combination, right? They're using both size and color to guide your eyes. This white background draws our attention, as well as like, this is clearly the biggest text. We go there first, then we move down. But we will break down exactly how that works and how you can use them together or separately to order the elements on your page. That gives you that kind of control over the balance, over the order, and lets you guide the user's eye. So we're talking about hierarchy today. We'll take a look at balance next week. But I think the most important thing is to kind of acknowledge that like those three things, size, placement, and color, they all work together to create this kind of hierarchy. We're going to like look at each one individually and kind of break it down. But usually when you're using this like practically to create real designs, you won't rely just on a single method. You will like, it would be rare to only use like size or to only use color. In fact, you should never only use color because that's not terribly accessible, but we will get into it. As an old stuffy guy, I think that of everything that's made after 1998, that it's unintuitive. I didn't see this comment when it came up contextually, so now it's just existing in the void for me. I have no idea what you're talking about. The dangers of streaming. So, all right. Size. Let's talk about size. So playing with size is probably one of the fastest and easiest ways to create the hierarchy in your designs. In fact, you probably already kind of do it without even thinking about it, because one of the most common examples of this is the like H1, H2, H3 kind of heading system that's built right into HTML, right? It kind of naturally structures the items on the page and gives them, right, this kind of order. So you can even see here in this example, they said like very important and then scaling down progressively, less important, less important, less important. So, oops, spam bot in the comments. Do I know how to get rid of that? Sure don't. Sure heckin' don't. Just ignore them. Hitch 0. That one's just wrong. So, yeah. When you order things by importance, right, like this is all built right into the kind of structure that we used to build web pages anyway, right? We can do it in just like print designs without this, but it kind of speaks to the way that this works, that it was so intrinsically built into how we make things for the web, right? The other thing that is unfortunately a good example of size in visual hierarchy is the word cloud. Word clouds are terrible design. Let's just start with that. You don't ever want to actually create one of these because they are a terrible way to communicate information, but they are a really good way to look at how visual hierarchy works, right? Yep, UI we find hard to understand. The web has just gotten progressively more and more complex and difficult ever since we moved away from like H1, H2, H3 on a page. So that's why this stuff is important. But anyway, looking at one of these word clouds, you can immediately see that like the first word that pops out to us is knowledge, right? Because it's so huge that like even though it's kind of down in the like kind of left bottom corner, which is not the normal place that our eyes would go first, right? I think we've talked about this on here before, but just in case we haven't, our eyes scan the page in a Z pattern, right? We go across the top and then we cut diagonally down through the middle and then along the bottom kind of last. That's why we see so many pages organized with like a header bar along the top, and then you get some big graphic right in the middle so that as your eyes scan across, we catch that, and then a footer along the bottom. Makes a lot of sense. All right. So here, even though hypothetically our eyes should go top, across, bottom, we're drawn right to knowledge because it is so much proportionally bigger that it grabs our eye right away. And then, of course, we kind of move down, right? And like the next few words that stand out to us are probably like learning, value, education, maybe student, you know. We kind of work our way down in terms of scale and size. There's also a little bit of color at play here in that once you get past the size, right, like knowledge is going to be the first thing you see no matter what. But when it comes to that like second largest tier of words, the visual weight starts to be influenced by color, by value specifically, right? So the deeper the value, so the darker the color, the more it pops out against that white background. There's a high level of contrast between the value of the background and the value of the word, and that's the thing that we'll see first. So, right, like learning is probably the second thing that you see here, if I had to guess. Feel free to throw in the comments if I'm wrong, but at least when I look at it, I see knowledge first, then I see learning, then I see value, and probably wisdom because it's darker, so a little bit of an exception, education, student, and then you keep working your way down from there, right? And maybe some of those are flipped for you, but in general, the rule of like starting big, working down will always hold. But jumping back to using those like H1s, H2s, all of that being built in to just like HTML and how we write code and how we write for the web is hugely beneficial because it allows our hierarchy to extend beyond just being purely visual, which is something that is otherwise so difficult, possibly impossible to achieve using design alone, right? But because those header structure, the headers are built into the literal structure of the web page. When people are using screen readers, when there's accessibility devices at play, that can really quickly communicate the page structure and the hierarchy to the people who are looking or scanning your page. It also really helps for the other developers who are coming in after you, right? Because they can scan down the code and immediately have a grasp of the hierarchy. What's most important, what's secondary, working your way all the way down. Without those, there's really no way of telling, right? Semantic HTML will help tell screen readers what they're looking at. It intrinsically organizes your page. When we, as like fully sighted people, open a website or an app, we do like a quick visual skim to try and find the contents that we need, right? If we're looking for something specific, if we're looking for a button or a title or whatever, we can just kind of like do a quick scroll at the page and see what's there. But our visually impaired users cannot always do that. However, their screen readers can. Screen readers can read out headings for sections, allows users to skip ahead, give them like quick overviews of the list, tells them what they can interact with by looking specifically for buttons or for links, you know, reading out content in menus and forms, all of that kind of stuff. But it will only do that for them if we have used those correct semantic elements that establish the hierarchy on the page and allow the screen reader to kind of skip from section to section the way that we can visually when we're looking at a page. And as we touched on before, also a lot easier for developers to parse and work with because they can see at a glance what every element is doing, why it's there. Speeds up your dev time, as well as honestly your onboarding. Because anytime you bring in somebody new and they have to like look at a page and try to figure out like what the heck everything is doing there, that's often a huge part of the learning curve. Is just kind of figuring out like, what is this? Slides stuck. Thank you. Unfortunately, I'm just not changing the slides. I'm just talking. This is just there. I should probably remove it because I'm not really talking about that anymore. It was disconcerting. But thank you and hello. I appreciate the help. I really do. So the other way to kind of talk about visual hierarchy and establish visual hierarchy is to talk about placement, right? And this is kind of similar. Let me see if I can jump back. Yeah. So that's the other piece of the puzzle that's happening here, right? Is that in addition to size, that's marking things as most, second, third, it's also in an order from largest to smallest as you work your way down, right? The other thing that makes a really good example for this is newspaper. Boom, right? Like another perfect example of having your really big headline right on the top and then kind of moving your way down through the page, making sure that things get less important as you work down. Hey, Nipam, glad you're here. We are talking about visual hierarchy and establishing order and importance through design. And we talked about size, and now we're talking about placement. So this is probably one of the most kind of intuitive or natural ways that people create hierarchy is to put the most important items all the way at the top and then work your way down. Especially with regard to newspapers, you might have heard people talk about putting items like above the fold. That was a term that really had a moment, I think, in web design, but is pretty outdated now. It came from these kinds of papers and where the literal fold would happen in a newspaper. with the idea that like as you were walking by a newspaper stand, you would see this kind of content, it would grab your attention, you'd buy a paper, right? And this idea kind of hung around into web design for a little bit. And for a very brief period, it did kind of make sense, right? Because there was, when devices were all roughly the same size, right? When everyone was looking at things on a desktop monitor, and desktop monitors were mostly about the same size, then this idea of the fold maybe had a little bit of credence, because the fold would be in the same place every time. However, now that is not the case. Yeah, for reasons that Newcomb actually just jumped ahead and talked about the thing that I was about to get into, which is this doesn't work anymore because we don't know where the fold is. Before, when everything was going to be on a desktop and monitors were roughly the same size, you could have a pretty good guess within usually like a few hundred pixels of where the fold was going to be. Now, forget about it. It is straight up impossible with the sheer number of desktop monitor sizes, devices. Are they looking at it on a phone, and which phone, on a tablet, which tablet, on a desktop monitor, in which way? There's no way of knowing. It doesn't make any sense anymore to restrict yourself to the idea of the fold. And following that, we actually have some really interesting data now that says users will pretty much always scroll when they open a page. And that was something that, again, we didn't really know when the internet was new. There wasn't that kind of assurance of user behavior. But now scrolling is so native. Everyone kind of understands. You open a web page, do a quick scroll, and skim for the information you're looking for. If it's not there, you close the page. However, it is so rare that someone will open a page and then close it without scrolling at all, which means that the fold straight up does not matter. You will occasionally still hear people talk about the fold. You can dismiss it. You can tell them they're wrong politely, but you can tell them that they're wrong. Yeah, everyone should just use iPads. Apple can decide for us. Yeah, even assuming everybody in the world is using Apple products, you'd still have a huge variety of folds, which I know, like you're just being sarcastic and it is funny, but also like even in an entirely Apple world, are they looking at it on an iMac? Are they looking at it on a MacBook Pro? Are they looking at it on an iPhone? And is it the most recent iPhone, or is it an iPhone mini, or is it an old iPhone 6? Are they looking at it on an iPad? Is that iPad in landscape or portrait mode? There's no way of knowing. Straight up no way of knowing. But I will say that the idea, the basic idea behind the fold still has a little bit of value, which is that your most important stuff needs to go at the top, right? That no matter what, even setting aside where the device breakpoint is and all of that, if you put your most important stuff at the top of the page, there's no way people will miss it, right? Yeah. Just use the latest iPad, everyone, all the time. All other devices just lock out. Perfect. What about languages that read in a different order? This is a good question. I'm glad you brought this up. If you are designing for right to left languages, right, like Hebrew, then this still works, the top down. This changes a little bit. There are some languages that do vertical. I think both Chinese and Japanese can do vertical sentence lines. Although that is less common on the web. You'll see that more even with those languages that can do vertical sentence. I'm trying to think of the right word for that. Vertical sentence lines, I'm going to call it for now. Most of them have converted to either left to right or right to left for web-based stuff, because it just makes more sense with scrolling. Otherwise, you scroll down. You have to scroll all the way back up to get to the top of the next line. So you'll see it, but it's rare, and it's usually more for call out quotes or things that they want. And those draw attention in their own way anyway, based more on size and placement. than necessarily the order. The only thing to keep in mind when you're talking about right to left languages is that earlier we talked about scanning the page in the Z pattern, right? Like starting left, reading right, crossing down the page, moving across the bottom. If you're in a right to left reading language, this will work the same way. You just start at the other side. You start right, scan left, skim the opposite way across the page, and then over so that you get a reverse Z. But otherwise, all of this still holds, right? Size, placement, color, all of that not impacted by the order in which the language is read. But really good question. It is interesting and difficult to, well, I guess maybe the more accurate way of saying it is it's difficult to design for something that will have to be read in multiple languages, some of which are right to left, some of which are left to right. If you just get to design specifically for right to left languages, not too bad, right? It's all the same principles. You're just organizing things in a different, right, with a different starting point. However, if you have to make sure that your page still works even when the starting point changes, that is a trick. That is a trick, y'all. Internationalization is such an interesting but hard challenge. The other thing that I found surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly difficult, but very difficult, is just the length of words and how much that changes. I worked previously at a company that had an international app. You could set the language and it would change everything, which was great, but also so hard. Even like just little things, buttons, lists, just whatever you think you could fit in a box, it will not fit. The difference between how much space something will take up in Chinese and how much space something will take up in German is just so different. Everything is so much longer in German. Oh yeah. They just look good in Swedish, look rough in Finnish. It is such a challenge. You really have to be even more flexible than you would have thought. Which is saying something, because I feel like web design in general has gotten very, very flexible now that we have to deal with responsiveness in this kind of way, right? Ever since responsive design has kind of moved away from those set breakpoints. I don't know how many of you were designing, making web pages like early, I guess maybe like right before 2010. I'm trying to think of when the iPhone came out. I think it was like 06 or 07, right? Right when smartphones were new and there was only like a handful of them. We went through this phase in web design that was like super fixated on breakpoints. It was very like bootstrappy, where you'd hit a specific breakpoint and like the whole layout of the page would change, would snap at that point, and then there'd be another one and everything would snap. Now, because there's so many devices and there's so many breakpoints, there's no way to code in every single one, every single device-based breakpoint. You would just lose your mind. Everything now is super flexible. We're in this kind of continually resizing era of design where like as you will change the width, like you could sit and play with your browser width and see everything kind of shrink and resize as you move. Because that's how we've had to shift our approach to responsive design without knowing where breakpoints would be. Ooh, that was a stretch. Ooh, tangent. Yeah. Doing web pages when Netscape was hot. I liked Netscape. Props to Netscape Navigator. It's very sad. But anyway, started off talking about the fold and the idea of newspapers and the idea of setting your visual hierarchy based on placement, which means that you would put your most important information at the top of the page and then work your way down the same way you would in a newspaper, starting with, right, like logo, big headline, sub headline, and then you see, you get your kind of like third tier headlines and then body copy, right? So you kind of can progressively see that the placement and the size together are indicating relative importance in this layout. We see this, of course, also on websites, right? So like Progress website is a pretty good example. So yeah. So obviously, right, like we talked about the Z style scanning, you'd start here, see the logo, scan across, then you scan vertically down. Your eyes would be interrupted, quote unquote, which, by the way, Gestalt principles, continuity. You'd be interrupted by this image, and then you kind of catch this button, right? You and then scan across the bottom. So, talking about placement, we see this here too, right? At the very top, logos and crucial information. Then we see size and placement combined here with this really big headline. And then immediately after, subheadline. Then here we see placement and size and color combined on this button. Then underneath we have kind of the subheadline, right? It's smaller than the main one. Still important, not as important as this guy. And we get into like body copy, smaller stuff. So you can kind of work your way down and it guides your eye through the page. The last piece of the visual hierarchy puzzle, which I kind of touched on a little bit there with the button, is color. And color is interesting and different because it really shifts based on the context, right? Like we talked about when we were in our color unit, color is entirely contextual, right? So what we, sorry, I was trying to like click buttons and talk at the same time and was incapable. The way that we understand color is entirely based on the colors around it, the colors behind it, the colors next to it. Very rarely does a color exist in like complete isolation. And the way that our eyes interpret that color are entirely based on what's nearby it. Which have paintings that are made of all the little dots that our eyes are meant to blend together. And then again with screens, because that's the way screens work too. It's the way pixels work. These little dots of color that our eyes blend together to make into shapes and to interpret. So in the same way, we grab an example over here. Here's a really good example of how our understanding of color shifts, and along with it, the visual weight of the color based on the background. So as you can see here, when we have a dark background, lighter value colors are the ones that come forward. When we have a light background, darker value colors are the ones that come forward. That has to do with contrast, right? A little bit about that earlier, where we're looking at the contrast in value between the background and the subject. So in this case, there's almost no, like these have very little visual weight, these really light yellows on this white background, because they almost blend in. Whereas these, with a much sharper contrast, come forward. And you can kind of see it, like, I feel like this graphic does a really good job of showing that it's not obviously a physical like receding, because it's all on one plane. But to our eyes, it looks like some colors come forward and others recede. So you can use this to your advantage, obviously, in UI design, right? Because you can make things stand out or not stand out as you want based on the kind of contrast that you create between the color and the background. You can also do this by using colors wisely, right? So here's an example. Here's a screenshot that I took of the Gmail composition window, right? And the only color that we see here is this blue send button. Everything else is black and white. That makes that blue button really pop, because again, we've created contrast. There's, grayscale, and then this one color. It stands out because there is nothing like it on the page. We can also do this. Here's another example. By leveraging contrasting colors. Colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel. Let me find a color wheel. The show where I just Google things and you watch. What fun. Love to watch me Google things, right? So yeah, here's a color wheel. We can see here's a Spotify ad that I grabbed as an example, because I think it's a really good example of using color to create this kind of visual weight, visual hierarchy. So we can see they're leveraging this orange and blue, right, that are directly opposite each other on the color wheel. So you've got this strong orange background and then this dark blue text. That makes it really come forward, really jump off the page, grabs our eyes there first, which is saying something, again, because the image, anytime we have a picture of an actual human making direct eye contact with us, that is something that humans are so trained to respond to, right? It's something that's so engaging to us. And so here, even though we have this picture of someone looking right at us, like direct, intimidating eye contact, a lot of times we will still read the word first because that is coming off the page. And again, when you think about other design choices that could have been made here, if this photo was not kind of tinted in this way, if it was just a regular photo, that effect would not be the same. They're completely playing on the idea of colors and what comes forward and what recedes in order to create this effect, right? So here's our image from earlier, and you can kind of see what they're doing here. They've got a darker color on a lighter background combined with the opposition on the color wheel. Super, super, super effective. Yeah. Recently had a project to drive user action with colored buttons. Yeah. What colors did you end up using? Did it work? Is it working? I'm curious now. Because the other thing that I want to make note of while we're talking about colors is how careful you have to be when you're using colors, right? Because color is or can be an accessibility issue. Because not everyone can see colors. Not everyone sees colors in exactly the same way that we do, right? So if you're dealing with someone who is visually impaired, whether that is some level of blindness or whether that is color blindness of some variety, and there are several varieties, all of those impact the way that we interpret colors. So while this kind of stuff is a good rule of thumb for people who are not colorblind, it all kind of goes out the window when you're talking to someone who is. With colorblindness, you can still leverage value, right? You can still create contrast with value, and you can still create hierarchy with value, which just has to do with, again, for those of you who may not have been here every single week when we talked about color, value has to do with the brightness, the lightness or darkness of a color. So you can add white to a color, which creates a tint that makes the value lighter. You can add gray to a color, which creates a tone, or black to a color, which creates a shade. Those make increasingly deeper values, right? So something like sky blue would have a lighter value than something like navy blue. Even when you when you completely grayscale something, right? And everything is just in like shades of black, white, and gray. That's when you've taken things down to their base values. All you're seeing is that lightness or darkness. There's no hue at all. If you are trying to be accessible for colorblind users, you can still leverage that. Obviously, with your blind users, all of that does not matter, but you can still create that hierarchy by leveraging your semantic elements, right? So placement comes into play hugely there, as well as making sure that you've written semantic HTML. That way you can start to communicate the size and relative importance by using those this is an H1 versus a P tag that can help give a screen reader and by extension a visually impaired user a feeling of the hierarchy and what's most important and what's kind of secondarily or less important, right? All right, using green buttons for the go forward action, and then orange or gray for filters. Worked on the contrast for accessibility. Yeah, so this one it's interesting green. Whew, that's a tangle of words and none of them actually became sentences. With colors, as we've talked about sometimes, I think, maybe, we can leverage like cultural understandings, things that are kind of broadly associated with that color, right? And Aztec, and I'm sure your team has done that with green buttons for go forward, right? We have associated green with go, red with stop forever, probably it has to be even before the dawn of traffic lights. I'm really curious where that started. Traffic lights would be the first thing that I would think of that uses the like green go, red stop. But in general, we definitely have an association with green as being like growth and moving forward, and red with being like danger, concern, to a more drastic extent, like blood, like a whoa, 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 danger kind of feeling. So I wonder, now I'm curious. Now I want to do some research on like the green-red history. Either way, the really important part to us is that you know about it, not you, but you, royal you, everyone. We know about it. And then we can leverage those kinds of like shortcuts in our design. That helps. It helps us be able to like move quickly and communicate things efficiently without having to like reestablish those kinds of meanings ourselves. And we can, lots of places do. Every go button is not going to be green on every website everywhere. And we learn them because like, yeah, we saw, I think the Gmail one had the blue send button. The more we use an application, the more we start to get a feel for the kinds of colors and the visual system that they're using. And we kind of go like, oh, okay, so here, like blue means go or blue means next. And we start to make that association. And as long as they are consistent throughout the entirety of their design, then that becomes ingrained. And the more we use the application, the more we engage with it or the website or whatever, we learn their visual system and we get really used to it. Sometimes if it gets big enough, like big visual systems will influence other visual systems. You see that especially, I would say like Apple has become very much that way, where like some of the things that they have done, some of the like both visual and I would say interactive like shortcuts that they have used have become so commonplace that we see them everywhere now. Yeah. Red was used for cancel or delete. Yep. Red is a good like attention grabbing color. We are very socialized to see red and like pause for a minute, be like, okay, what was that? Stop signs, fire engines, yeah, all sorts of stuff where we see red and we're like, ooh, okay, what was that? So if you're muted in pastel, this is not to be too garish. Yep, draw attention, but keep their intention subtle. I think that's another thing that's worth noting, since I'm just riffing on comments now, is that you don't always have to use like the brightest or the most like classic interpretation of a color in order to retain all of that meaning. You can use pastel greens, you can use deeper red, you can use muted colors, you can use like whatever, and you can still hold on to a lot of the meaning associated with that color. It's also good, I think, for when you're working with a limited palette of colors, especially like brands that have very specific colors that you can't move from. You can use kind of the tints, tones, and shades of that color to give yourself some more options to play with and to create that kind of contrast within the limited palette that you have. I worked at a company for a while whose main color was orange, and that was, to be honest, a design nightmare. Like, the company was great. What they did was really cool. Their color was this very nearly neon orange, and it's just horrendous to design with because it is so bright. And so you don't want to put that on everything, on every button, on every call out. Like, it would just be like bright orange everywhere. The other thing with orange that's awful is that it's kind of an accessibility nightmare. So, right, with an orange background, neither white nor black are very readable on top of it because it's right there. The actual science behind this, which is fun, right? So, the actual science behind this is that red, like pure, true red, has an exactly like 50% value. If you were to grayscale it, it would be exactly like middle gray, right? So if like white is 0 and black is 100, when you grayscale red, the value is 50, 100%, like right in the middle, which means that there's not a lot of contrast either way you go, right? So ideally, you want to create a high contrast ratio so that if you're dealing with something that has that, like, 0, you want to put something as close to 100 over it, which makes it the most readable. That's what's being computed when you use those like color contrast ratio kind of checkers, right? So these like, and they're talking about like a contrast ratio of whatever. Can't find a good example. That's what they're talking about. Because orange is not that far from red, especially like a true bright orange. It has that same problem. It's not exactly 50%, but it's pretty close. I think it's just a little bit lighter. I think it's probably like closer to like a 40 or something. So white, completely unreadable on it. Black, a little bit better, but not great. Also, then you get weird like Halloween Town situations when your whole design is black and orange. It's not cute. So we ended up, the TLDR of that is that we ended up almost entirely using tints and tones of orange, either lighter or darker values of orange, so that we could create the contrast that we needed to use orange accessibly. So yeah. Legacy site had very few colors. They had to be intentional and reserved. It is hard. I feel like that is probably one of the hardest challenges with color, is working with places that have a super limited color palette and still try to be accessible. You end up just really kind of having to come up with new ways to work with what you've got. In some ways that can be a fun challenge. In other ways, it's a little bit exhausting. And almost always the solution does tend to be introducing new colors. So it's only so much you can do. And hi, welcome. I just attempted to try and read your username, and I think I'm failing at it. Kashiba? Is it like a Shiba, like a dog joke? I'm so curious now. But welcome. I'm glad you're here. We are actually relatively close to the end of our stream today. Death by Design is just a quick, short hour of design-focused fun. Today we talked about creating visual hierarchy through size, placement, and color, ideally all of them combined, in order to guide people's eyes around and through your applications and websites. If anyone has questions or thoughts or something that they're working on that they want us to take a look at, I want to try working this into the end of each show, where we just kind of have like 5 to 10 minutes of like, I don't want to call them office hours. That sounds like super professorial. But that idea where it's like, if you're working on a design or if you've got a design problem or something, to like throw it in the chat and we can all look at it together. So short notice today. If you have one, feel free to throw it in there. But in general, maybe for next week, kick that around. And if there's anything you're working on, you should bring it to Dev by Design next week and we will all tackle it together. But for now, I think that's it for today. So thank you for hanging out, for starting your week, your Monday with us, with Dev by Design. I hope that it was fun, interesting, maybe even learned something. Maybe you just had some time to drink your coffee in peace, in which case I'll call that a success too. So, all right, folks, have a great day. Thanks for hanging out. I'll see you next week. Same bad time, same bad channel. Have a good one, y'all.